Welcome to the Wave Podcast. My name's Connor. I'm here with Sunny, and we're lucky enough to be talking to George Gascón, who is about 3 years into a 4-year term as Los Angeles District Attorney. And it's about the time, I think, when you would be looking back on your successes and failures and kind of taking stock. As we start, do you think you could give yourself, sort of a grade on how you've done in this mission of criminal justice reform?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much.
Right,
Appreciate you guys taking the time to do this. I think that I would probably overall give myself a positive grade. Unquestionably, there are things that have worked well, other things that continue to need improvement. But when you look overall and you look at the platform upon which I was elected, right, which was looking for a path to create safety in our community at the same time that we were going to move away from the past impact of mass incarceration, of death penalty, prosecuting kids as adults, sometimes a lacking on police accountability. If you look at all those components, I think we've done very well. And sometimes I think it's important to illustrate, just talk about the history of some of the things, right? So, I'll give you a good example here. We've looked at conviction integrity as a cornerstone of our work, right? Because I think that credibility for the entire criminal legal system has to be based on people believing that the system is going to be fair and honest. And, we had a case of a gentleman named, his last name is Hastings, right? Mr. Hastings was convicted, he was prosecuted and convicted of rape and murder 38 years ago, almost 39 years ago now. And after he was in prison for 18 years, he kept insisting that he was innocent from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And he was tried 3 times. The office actually was seeking the death penalty twice, and the jury would not agree on the death penalty and hung. And then finally, on the 3rd try, he was convicted and given life without the possibility of parole. Roughly about 18 years into his sentence, as he became aware that DNA technology was improving, he requested that the office test the DNA information that was in the rape kit from the victim of the rape and murder. And he was told that rape kit had been destroyed. He asked multiple times. He was told that it was not there. When I became the district attorney, it was brought to my attention through the Innocence Project that, Mr. Hastings continues to insist on his innocence, and he would like to have DNA tested. We look and we found the DNA.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And we had it tested, and it came back to someone else who, after Mr. Hastings had been convicted, went on to rape and kill someone else, and eventually was caught, and then he was prosecuted, and he died in prison. You need to understand the import of what it's like to be in prison for 38 years when you're innocent.
It's psychologically horrible.
Yeah, and having the prosecutor tell you that there's no way that they can test the DNA and lying to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what impact that has not only on the individual but the entire community, the lack of credibility of the system. We're looking and we're aggressively trying to correct some of the wrongs of the past. At the same time, moving forward, we're looking for ways to improve our service delivery, to make sure that we are working with communities to both address accountability, especially people that are harming our community, but at the same time looking to work with victims in trauma-informed care, trying to create a system that is based basically on 3 corners of a stool: education, prevention, and enforcement. And I don't think one is more important than the other. I think that they all have to work together.
It seems to me that most people would think of the DA's office as particularly involved with prosecuting criminals and managing sentences, and they don't often think of it as being involved with the alternative to incarceration. there seems to be a limitation to the powers that you might have to rectify the injustices of the system, especially when the legal arguments that your critics give are that you simply have to enforce the policies like the three strikes law and enhancements. The special directives that you issued on your first day of office, how have those been received over time, and have they had a strong effect?
I think to begin with, I'm going to kind of turn it around. They certainly have had a strong effect, right? And I think that there are some people that are being, hoping and trying to see a system that works more humanely and that actually uses science and data in order to achieve safety in our communities. And for that group of people, which I believe is the majority of our community, it has worked very well. By the way, all these directives were put together by working groups of experts in the different fields.
They're very data driven, and I'd recommend
Yeah.
any audience member read them. They're publicly available.
Yeah, they're posted on our website. They're very data driven. They were vetted through a legal team as well to understand whether there was any infirmity legally. Frankly, with one exception that actually the California Supreme Court agreed with us and they're going to be reviewing, which has to do with three strikes, and I get into in a moment. Every other policy has been deemed to be legal, right? Period. And we know that they were all legal. We had, really people that were deeply embedded into the legal system for years and crafted this. It's not something that I wrote. Now, there are people that, have been sort of enculturated in the years of high levels of incarceration, the concept of, extreme punishment. And for some of those people, this directives and the application of these directives has had a negative impact on their mind, right? Number one, we are approaching our accountability on our interventions differently. We're not seeking the death penalty because we know that it doesn't work. In fact, Mr. Hastings is a perfect example. He could have been executed and he was innocent.
Right. Isn't it also like highly very, very expensive,
It's
unnecessarily?
Horribly expensive, right? I mean, look, punishment is very expensive, right? Now, that is not to say that people shouldn't be held accountable, and people need to be, and sometimes people are dangerous and they need to be separated from the rest of us because they're dangerous at that moment. The question becomes for how long and what are the interventions that are going to make us all safer at a level that is both socially and economically responsible,
right?
Because we can spend billions of dollars in a system that actually doesn't yield any results. Now I'll give you another story, because I think stories are important for the audience to understand. I have a case recently. A mother reached out to me and says, "Hey, my son committed a crime, and he was prosecuted and convicted. He's in prison now." And she said, and you know what? He did the act, and he's paying his debt to society. And it's under my administration, by the way. But she says, he is in prison. He's coming back out. His sentence, I think it was about 5 years or something like that. He says, immediately he approached the prison officials and said, I want to start programming. I want to get an education. I want to, work on my anger and all this stuff. And he was told, well, you're going to have to wait about 4 years to get there, right? Because we don't have the resources. So here you have a young man that, readily admits, I was rightfully convicted. I harmed someone. I'm paying the price of that.
Right.
But I'm coming back out, and I want to come back out as a better person. And part of that is working on my own issues and educating myself, being able to be job ready when I get out, which I believe is a important function of accountability and the prison system, right? But he's told you got to wait 4 years. Well, 4 years, he could be very close to release time, and he's just basically vegetarian. He's coming back out. He will come back out with none of his issues being dealt with, not being job ready, basically on the same way that he went in.
Right.
Right. We have a budget for our prison system that's about $16 billion. About 4% of that is dedicated to reentry and rehabilitation. Right. You go to a place like Germany or Scandinavian countries, and the budgets are completely differently, right? Their prison systems are designed and budgeted to rehabilitate and reenter people into society. Therefore, the recidivism rate is a fraction of ours. And I think it's important for the audience to understand when we talk about recidivism, for a lot of people, it's an abstract term. But it's not. It actually, what that means is that people reoffend, and every time that they reoffend, they're new victims. And there's a cost both socially to our entire community. There's a cost to the victim and their family and their community. And then there's an economic cost, right? So what we are trying to do is we're trying to inject that into the conversation. So to the point that you asked earlier, where how much of that do I control? And, obviously I don't control the prison system, but I have a bully pulpit, right? So when that mother called me, I was really disturbed by the fact that this was going on. We talked to some people. We actually talked to the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, which is a group, it's a nonprofit that works in trying to assist people in prison and reentry, and they have made a commitment to work with him, right? But how many other individuals are out there? And by the way, I'm not naming his name because he could be retaliated against, right? That would want to be rehabilitated, that want to come back as a better person, but they don't get that opportunity, and they don't have a parent call me or shoot them an email and asking for help. The system should not rely on having a parent that knows how to send an email to the DA. The system should rely on this is the way that we do business. And these are the things that I can highlight and write, and then quite frankly, working with you and other media, we can amplify this message so our community can say, well, what do we want out of the system? Do we just simply want to punish and let them come back and reoffend, or do we want a system where this person can come back as a safer, productive human being, right? And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do.
Right, and alternatively, one of the things he has to worry about in those 4 years in prison, even though he wants to do better, is the fact that he could be stabbed, jumped, potentially raped or killed.
Yep.
And there's a whole thing about how the culture within prisons and the whole prison industrial complex system is just one of the worst parts about America. My question is that a lot of people are cynical and critical on you about your how you use modifiers, or rather
Enhancements.
There you go.
Yeah.
Or
lack thereof.
Yeah, or lack thereof. And what is your response to that?
Yeah, look, I mean, let's begin by saying that all the data and science indicates that enhancements do not create any more safety. All they do is add years to a prison sentence,
which
right?
adds recidivism chance.
Adds recidivism chances,
I would agree, yeah.
and has huge economic costs. I mean, if you consider that in today's dollars, every year in prison, assuming that you're a healthy human being, is about $100,000. And I say assuming you're healthy, because we got people in prison in their 70s and 80s that are costing us $1 million, $800,000 a year. They're no longer, they're in a wheelchair. They're completely not dangerous to anyone.
Right. And
we're paying this crazy, this crazy economic cost that could be used better for education and many other things. But parking aside the fact that it has no real impact on safety, and it and it's very costly, which to me that could be enough, right? But then the other component you have to look is at the racial impact of enhancements, right? Enhancements, and for the audience so they understand what it is, the California sentencing structure, when you are convicted of a crime, there's a sentencing triad, right? There is a low term, mid-term, and high term. And generally the courts are instructed that if there are no mitigating or aggravating circumstances, you go to the mid-term. If there are aggravating circumstances, you go to the high term.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're mitigating, you go to the low term, right? And that was the way we conducted business for years. That's the way that most of the world conducts business when it comes to sentencing. But in the United States, and California kind of led the way, we started with adding enhancements. So we said, well, if you had committed a crime before, now instead of going to the trial, we're going to add, another 2 or 3 years for this. And if you had a gun, we're going to add, 5 years. And if you were a registered gang member, even though we know that those data files are very, very broken, we're going to add some more. So pretty soon you could have a case where perhaps your sentence would have been, let's say on the aggravating side, maybe 8 years, but now with enhancements, you're going to prison for 20, 30, 40 years, right? So it adds up very quickly. And there is absolutely, as I said earlier, no connection to to any benefit other than warehousing people, but there is the economic impact, the social impact that are so damaging. So what we have done is we look at enhancements and we say, well, is there going to be an important public service in doing this? And by the way, part of my own evolution here, when I created the policy initially, we said we were only going to do, initially I said no enhancements. There was a lot of, people say, well, what about, hate? And what about vulnerable victims? And I said, okay, well, we know that it doesn't necessarily end hate, but I understand people, this is a time, this is a post in administration that enhance hate. So hate crimes are up, and I get it. A lot of my friends were very worried, so we did those. And then we continue to evolve, and we have created now a vehicle where prosecutors can seek an enhancement in some cases, and in cases where we have a committee of very executive in the office with a lot of experience. They look at the case where the prosecutor is seeking the enhancement. We look at the mitigation that the defense may ask for, and we may actually grant the application of enhancement in some cases, like with guns especially, because we know we have a problem with guns. But we recognize, by the way, we're doing this really primarily because we know that the community is really antsy about this stuff. This is not going to stop the use of guns. I mean, in fact, I often tell people we have neighboring district attorneys that regularly apply these enhancements to the maximum, and their crime rates are significantly higher than ours. So if enhancements work, you would think that those counties would have a better
crime rate
rate than we do, but they don't, right? And then you go into other states where are very punitive, like Texas, Tennessee, and all those places, and their violence rates are substantially higher than they are here.
Yeah, red states have higher crime rates than blue states, and rural areas have higher crime rates than urban areas.
Right? So if you have, and I tell people, listen, I know emotions win over logic every day. That's why I try to give you a personal story where I can, because I know that people will remember Mr. Hastings.
Yeah, they will relate to it a lot easier.
But they will not remember the conversation that we're having about crime rates, right? So I'm trying to balance that, because I know how we operate as human beings, but we have to at some point bring some logic to the emotion as well, because otherwise we're just not a thinking system.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that almost emotional or spiritual need for the public to see the victim made whole somehow by punishing the offender, where that may not actually be good for society, as you would argue, right?
Well, and here's and I'm so glad that you talk about victims, because we've actually put a ton of work on victims, right? So we hired 16 additional victim services representatives since I've been in the office. We created a victims advisory board that is composed of former victims of violent crime and family members of victims of violent crime to inform our practice. The survey after survey, including one that was done in LA County in 2020, 60% of the victims of violent crime said they believe that their offenders should be given an opportunity to rehabilitate. They believe in redemption, but they also were very critical of my office and said, our trauma was never dealt with, right? We were traumatized, and we were allowed to stay traumatized. The only thing that the prosecutor wanted to do was use my testimony to make sure that I could help with the prosecution. That's
fascinating, and I'd like to dig into that, because it goes to an inherent limitation in the justice system as it is fashioned now. The DA's office has the power to determine what happens with the offender or the supposed criminal, but it doesn't have a lot of power to restore or make whole the victim in the case. That seems to be dealt with by other avenues. Can you talk about what power you have and that board has to help the victims of supposed crimes?
Yeah, so, interestingly enough, it's mixed, right? You're absolutely right to a great extent, but it's nuanced in the sense that under state law in California, the district attorney has a victim services component, right? And there's a state compensation board that provides compensation for victims of violent crime, assuming that they have the financial needs in order to deal with their trauma, deal with moving expenses, burial costs for the family. It's very onerous, but nevertheless, it's there. What we're doing is, rather than traditionally a victim services being, okay, here's the website to go get apply for compensation. Here's how you can complete all these forms. And by the way, your next court date is going to be April 20th, and we like to be there at 8:30 in the morning so you can testify. Right, that was a component. What we're saying today is, we owe a lot more to that. Right. So the first of all is, how do we reach immediately? First of all, some victims may not want to cooperate. Right. Our policy before was pretty much, you don't cooperate, you don't show up for that court date, we're not going to help you. Right. It's all predicated on cooperation. Well, that sort of ignores the fact that we have people in the community that may not be able to cooperate for many reasons, right? I'll give you another story. We had a case, actually, the California Supreme Court was very critical of my office and one of my prosecutors. We had a murder, right? And there was this witness, really, who was a passenger on the car where the individual was murdered. And we tried to get this person to be a witness, and she refused because she believed that would put her life in jeopardy, which, by the way, it was very real, okay? So we then turn around and say, okay, if you don't cooperate with us, we're going to prosecute you as an accessory to murder. And we did, and we got her convicted. And she went to prison as an accessory to murder because she refused to be a witness to support the prosecution of the murder in this case. This case went all the way to the California Supreme Court, and the California Supreme Court, in a scathing response, said, "We've never heard of using the legal system to call a victim a witness and accessory to a crime, prosecute her and send her to prison." She was released. But the point is that, we rather than help the victim, what we did is we aggravated her situation. So what we do now is we say, look, we love for you to cooperate if you can, but we understand that you may not be able to. Regardless, we're not going to condition our services on your cooperation. We're going to provide services. We're going to provide all the interventions that we can, because we want to deal with your trauma. Because here's an important component of this. If you look at the people that are in prison today in jails, for men, over 80% will tell you that they have been victims of violent crime. For women, it's over 90%. In fact, they will tell you that they were the victims of sexual abuse. People that commit crimes generally have a journey that they have been victimized, they have been traumatized, they lose hope, they don't care for themselves, and therefore they cannot care for you and I. If we can provide early intervention and we can deal with the trauma, we can create a path for somebody to go from being a victim to being a survivor.
I was seeing a broader picture of the DA's office. Not only are you deciding on sentences and prosecuting people, but you are providing help to victims, and then exerting some power in the institutions that will try to prevent crime from happening. There's a third area. There's what you're doing to rehabilitate or reintegrate people who have committed crimes or are accused of committing crimes, but otherwise aren't going to prison. That seems to be one of the things that people are really nervous about, especially in conservative communities, where they think, oh, you're just letting all these people out into the streets, and what are they going to do then? You're letting people out of the jails, but you don't have an alternative solution. What is that alternative solution?
Right. So, I mean, look, the system is evolving, right? And it's evolving very quickly. We are working with service providers that are actually yielding some very good results. For instance, work with the Amity Foundation, who's now done peer review research, and they're a reentry service, right? Mm-hmm. They take people coming out of prison, they take people in some diversion programs, and they put them in a residential treatment where they deal with mental health issues, substance abuse, but they also deal with things like getting you job ready, job training, right? Dealing with anger management, all these other things, right? And the people that are coming through Amity, their recidivism rate is a portion of for the people that are just being put out on the streets. We're working with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. They start working with people actually in prisons and jails, helping people come back. We're working with other nonprofits that deal with juveniles. So we are bringing other resources and other conversations to the table. That's sort of the glass full, half full. Let me tell you what the half empty glass is, which we have to deal with. We still don't have enough resources, right? And I often see people, a question that I get asked all the time. In fact, I was having a meeting with, the LA County Chiefs of Police yesterday. We have, we're really developing a good working relationship, and we have a lot of really progressive chiefs of police that understand the business has to evolve. But one of the questions that I often get asked, and I was asked yesterday, I said, well, don't you think that you put some of the stuff, some of this diversion and stuff, before there were places to send people to? And were you premature? Should we first of all create the places for people to go to? And it's almost a chicken and an egg question, right?
Right.
Is if we continue to do business as always, would there be an urgency to create
alternatives?
Right. And the question I would argue is probably not, right? At the same time, we have a responsibility, and I have a responsibility for the here and now. So it's a very delicate dance that we're engaging in all the time. We're sending some people to prison that in a better environment we wouldn't, because they would be better off in a mental health facility that is secure. But we don't have that place, so we know that today we got to send that person to prison or jail. Other people we evaluate and we say, well, we actually found a program, and we think that it's safer for you to go to this program than go to a jail or prison, and we try to do that. We're dealing with human beings, right? I mean, we can use risk assessment tools, the courts do it regularly, but the reality is that you're always working with situations that evolve and people evolve, and there's never going to be 100% choice. What we do know is that the things that we're doing are more likely to create safety over a longer period of time, and they're more likely to be the kind of things that as we grow capacity, and by the way, our county board of supervisors is working hard to try to create capacity, that this will only get better with time, and that the next generation of people like me, the next generation, quite frankly, your generation, because you guys are very young, you will hopefully begin to see the yields of this. And, the interesting thing about crime, by the way, people were freaking out because during COVID we had this sort of increase in crime nationwide, more so in the red jurisdictions than in others, but nevertheless, it was an increase. But we're now coming back to sort of the pre-COVID days, normal, right? Our homicides are coming down in the county and the city of LA. Violent crime is starting to come down.
I think I remember looking some stuff up. 2022's homicides went down a few from 2021, which was by far the most violent since 2020. But 2023 is there's a bigger drop. You can clearly see that there is more
a bigger
of a drop.
Yeah. Right. So which we believe that is a product of there's some normalization again, right? I mean, COVID. Look, no one knew how to deal with a pandemic unless you were here in 1918, 1919 during the Spanish flu, right?
Right.
And that was in the middle of a World War II, so the conditions were very, very different, right? But the reality is that we're getting out of that cycle, and while COVID's still here and we still got to be careful, it's not what we were. So I think that what we're seeing now is sort of a normalization, and then that normalization brings the opportunity for us to continue to do the things that the county had already started to invest in, and hopefully continue to grow that.
Yeah, I'm hearing an economic argument that on the one hand you are creating a supply of people that would go into programs that are alternatives for incarceration by not sending them to jail, and then hopefully that increased supply will promote demand for those programs, and then we'll get the supply of programs to match. On the other hand, the increase in supply of those people who would otherwise go to jail seems to be the problem that people in the community have who want to see more incarceration. They're okay with warehousing people to some extent. There's like an emotional core there.
Sure.
how do you, convince somebody who wants to see justice done, quote unquote justice, that what they're seeking is not justice? Like, what is justice as you can administrate it?
It can't be retribution. It has to
Right.
be actual
Right.
justice. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, and I always say this to people, I will validate your feelings, right? Because it's no way for me to tell you how to feel, right?
Mhm.
And this is a conversation that I have with my family members, right? I can try to help you work through your feelings, but your feelings are real to you, right? And it goes back to the issue of emotion versus logic, right? So I always begin by saying, your emotions are real. If you feel, and by the way, if you or someone that you know were personally victimized, you're obviously going to be in a different place. The problem that we have more often than not is that people are experiencing victimization through the saturation of stories that are being thrown in social media and in certain news outlets that get repeated over and over and over again. You'll see an incident and you see it 20 times in a day, right? And by the time you see it the 20th time, you don't think of one incident repeated 20 times. You think of 20 incidents. So
the over-sensationalization
exactly.
of
So
crime, right?
for you then it's my God, the world's falling, and you develop a certain emotional reaction to that, which is very valid, right? So I acknowledge that, and then what we try to do is we try to then start walking through what are the things that work, what are the things that we're doing, what are the things that we're lacking of, and try to get to a place of understanding without invalidating somebody's feelings. Look, I often tell people say, when you talk about incarceration, it's like we came from a good place, right? We didn't. In fact, crime started to go up in LA County in 2020 before COVID came in, right? 2019 was a very low year of crime for the nation. In fact, it was a abnormally low when you look at a 10-year average. But then 2020 started to increase, and I was not the DA then, right? I became the DA at the end of the year, December of that year. So the trend was already increasing, and people will argue that it was COVID related. I mean, who knows? There are a lot of components to that. And then 21 was a horrible year, and then 22 we started to sort of start tapering, and now we're seeing 23 sort of hopefully a different cycle. So what I try to do is begin by acknowledging your feelings, trying to assess whether your feelings are based on you being personally victimized for someone or exposure to the narrative, and then try to work from there.
That is not an engagement with the classical idea of sort of biblical justice. What kind of justice are you administering?
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, the Bible is like the Constitution, right? We can pick up a lot of different pieces of it and take them out of context and come up with a different conclusion. I often tell people that if Jesus Christ was here today, Jesus Christ would be a very progressive reformer.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Second Testament.
I'm willing to fight that fight with anybody, because I don't think that Jesus Christ would tell you that punishment was the way to fix problems in our society. In fact, he spoke to a different way of addressing business. So often when, if we're talking about religion, I say, why don't we do the Christian thing, right? Because if we're doing the Christian thing, it's about redemption, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I take this one step further. I don't care whether you're looking at the Quran or you're looking at the Torah. I mean, most major world religions are based on the concept that human life is worthy of redemption, and that it has to be centered in our core belief system. So when people talk about an eye for an eye in the Bible, and I said yes, but I think contextually we have to look beyond that, right? You have to look at the teachings of Jesus or the teachings of Muhammad or David, or and again, you can go through almost any major religion in the world, and you would see that when you look into it, they're deeply about peace, and they're deeply about redemption and the value of human life, right? So for me, the function of government and the institution is about one of providing accountability to create a safety mechanism for our community. You harm others, there has to be a level of accountability, because it's not only accountability to the victim, but it's accountability to all of us. And then we have a function of ensuring that if you're dangerous, that we're going to segregate you from the rest of us until we figure out how to make you not dangerous, right? So that's how I approach the work. But I love the conversation when we get into religion, because if we were all doing the Christian or the Muslim thing to do or the Jewish thing to do, we would have a heck of a lot less crime.
I agree.
You were a cop in the 90s in Los Angeles,
Yes.
and I heard you describe some of the mood during that time as an insurrection,
Right.
which is a loaded word these days. It implies that the government is seen as not representative of the people. Why did you use that word to describe L.A.?
Yeah, well, look, I you're absolutely right. I was a cop working in South LA during during the time of Rodney King, right? And you know, when the and I call them riots when the riots broke up, which I call an insurrection today, but I used to call it a riot. You know, I really believe that, you know, this was really motivated by complete disregard for the social compact, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
right? There was lawlessness, and by the way, I don't want to imply that there were not some people that were rioting. I saw some of those, but it took me several years to get to a place where I began to recognize that while unquestionably there were some people that were just there for the ride, there were a lot of people that were just basically the boiling point of anger and the disenfranchisement and the injustices had brought this to a boiling point. And that this was more of an insurrection when you look at the core driving force behind it, that just simply people wanted to break windows and steal stuff from a store. And, you know, and it took me a long time to get there. And it took me a lot of introspection and really educating myself and maturing in my own development of public safety.
So there was a different social contract then that people were rebelling against. They sought change.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, and nowadays there's a core in the nation that seems to be unhappy with what they perceived as an actual change in that social contract. They want to go back, and we had this recent insurrection on January 6th that was a sort of postmodern representation of that. Do you think the social contract has actually changed, or do you think we still have work to do?
Look, I mean, we're always going to, by the way, I think the social contract is a journey, not a destination.
Right.
So we're always going to evolve. I mean, I often tell people that I find it almost comical that very smart people say that the Constitution should be interpreted as our founding fathers interpreted. I mean, that would mean that we would still be riding a buggy with a horse pulling it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so there is an evolution, and I believe that, you know, the social compact evolves with contextually where we are today, as it did in the 90s. I think that the one thing that I'd like to bring out is that while there's no question that there's a segment of our community that, you know, feels that, you know, government's not working for them in a certain way, and you have January the 6th, there's another segment of the community that thinks that government's not working for the same things that the people in January 6th would want to go back to, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not an absolute answer to the problem, and that's why I often say that so much of this is not Republican or Democrat. It's about bringing our humanity to place. But you know, when you look at election results, right, which I think they're very telling, and I'm going to go through the most recent one, and this is in Chicago, right?
Mm-hmm.
You had clear choices. You had two people running for mayor. You had a man that was running for mayor on enlarging the size of the police department and sort of going back to the past. And you had another man that came up and said, you know, I believe that yes, we have safety problems. Yes, I don't know all the answers, but I think that we need to try a different path, right? And thankfully, from my point of view, Mr. Johnson won this race, right? And it speaks to me about how often people think that scaremongering and, you know, fear-mongering and scaring people to death is going to be the path for electoral success. But over and over, we've seen that in LA, and we've seen in other parts of the country where people, yes, we're scary, yes, we're worried, But we don't want to go back to the things that didn't work before. We're a little unsure about what the future looks like, but it should not be going back to the past. And I think, and I know this sounds a little corny, but that old definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I think I think our public is sophisticated enough to see that.
Systems have to change over time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mentioned the dichotomy between the two groups and the two insurrections because some people have mentioned a dichotomy between you and Donald Trump in that both of you were elected by people who wanted a certain sort of wrecking ball reform. They viewed Donald Trump as someone who would come in and fight the institution from within and redirect it. And he failed at that. You have two deputy DAs that recently announced runs in 2024. So did you view yourself as someone who was coming in contra to the institution? And how has the institution reacted to your reforms?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I would say that I'm not only philosophically, but actually, if you look at operationally, Donald Trump and I are two different guys.
Oh, of course,
right?
yeah.
No, but I'm
it's
going to
very
get
philosophical.
to that. No, I hear you. But if you look at the popular vote, right? Donald Trump lost that popular vote by a long shot.
But you're also not an egomaniac.
I'm not. Well,
but
yeah.
there's a certain anti-establishment flair that I think you could cop to.
But for me, it's more about not so much as look. I get asked this all the time. I'm not an abolitionist, right? I believe that we need to have prisons. I believe that we need to have good police, good prosecution. My argument is always what is the right size of that, and how do you shepherd limited public resources in a way that maximizes the investment that we put in, right? For me, for instance, I'll give you a perfect example. For me, there is something that is inherently wrong in a society where we pay police officers more money than we pay teachers. Right? Now, I believe the police officers should be very well paid. By the way, I don't think we should cut their pay, but I would argue that teachers need to get paid more. Right? I would argue that nurses need to be paid more. Right? These are people that are in the business of healing and building.
So you view yourself as coming from the center within the institution to a certain extent.
100%. The arguments that I'm making would have been very centrist argument just a few years ago, right? They have become less so because we have shifted so far to the right in some corners of our society that the center continues to move to the right.
It's reactionary.
For some. Exactly. So, I travel, right? I like to travel. I've looked at the German system. I spent time looking at German prisons a few years ago, not that long ago, 4 or 5 years ago. Looking at Portugal, and I talk to people in those environments. I talk to police, prosecutors, and when I'm talking to them, I'm told, well, that's just like you're not telling me anything that I don't know. This is like the way we do business, right? So it's that context that has shifted so far in some quarters of our society that have made what it would have been a very centrist argument no longer a centrist argument. Look, I'll give you a perfect example, okay? I grew up in a Republican family. I'm not a Republican, but I grew up in a very, very conservative Republican family. My father, and I disagree with him, but my father was a believer in Reagan and, trickle-down economics, which I think is a debunked concept, but he believed in it. But if you look back at Ronald Reagan when he was president, and you tried to put him in today, he would get thrown out of office by the Republicans, right? Ronald Reagan brought in amnesty. Ronald Reagan understood that, number one, there were a lot of people in this country that were here and they were working and they needed a path to legalization. And number two, he understood the economic implications of a nation that increasingly is getting older and that we need to import labor in order for us to continue to grow economically.
We have a huge demand for labor even now.
100%, right? So you look at a person like Ronald Reagan, most Republicans say, well, he's kind of like the one of the center, the cornerstones of republicanism, but yet his policies today would be deemed as contrary to the xenophobic policies that are driving public policy in the Republican Party today, which really shows, the shift. I mean, a guy like Gerald Ford could not be a president. He could not be a Republican nominee today, right? So, we're in a world where what would have been deemed normal and centrist no longer is, just simply because the pendulum in some quarters, by the way, has shifted tremendously. Now, I understand there's a reaction to that. But, I often hear people say, well, this is your guys talking about socialism and all this stuff. And in fact, I was talking to some good friends of mine that are very hardcore Republicans, but they're in their 60s and 70s. So I said, you know what? You're absolutely right. Let's get rid of Social Security tomorrow.
Well, wait a minute.
Right? No, but wait a minute. Let's get rid. Social Security is a socialist concept. I mean, the Republicans fought the creation of Social Security, right? Let's get rid of Medicare. Well, you can do that. Why couldn't I? This is...
So you would hope that your reforms are something that's going to be so institutionalized that they can't get rid of it.
Unquestionably, because they make social and economic sense. And by the way, I don't believe that they're static. Right? I believe that they will continue to evolve. I believe that there will be future generations that will come back and take it to a whole level that I may not even envision today. Right? But they cannot go back to the past.
I wanted to jump in real quick. You were talking about juvie and helping get kids back on. Have you ever heard of, there's two organizations, I believe they're both nonprofits. Well, one of them doesn't specifically help kids, or I don't think they both do, but one of them is Homeboy Industries and the other one is Prison Project, Act Now or something.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard of those two?
Yeah, actually, I'm very familiar with both, but more familiar with Homeboy Industries, right? I mean, so Father Boyle, by the way, was someone that I admire deeply. He is one of my heroes and someone that I view through his work as a mentor. Homeboy's Industry has been one of those consistent organizations in our community that has created a model for people to be given an opportunity to redemption, right?
Right.
And the people that go through Homeboy's Industry end up, by and large, doing much better. And, and Greg Boyle would tell you, I understand that some people are not ready for us. Sometimes some people come up, they still got the blank stare in their eyes and all that stuff. I say, you're not ready for us yet. And he gets that. But what he does, and when I say the organization is created because it's so much bigger now but it's his leadership and his vision, is really understand that a system that is based in redemption. By the way, and Father Boyle, obviously implies he is a Jesuit priest, right? So he's definitely a Christian and a man of God, and he says, our work is based on the Bible. It's based on the work of Christ, right? It's redemption. And by the way, we're working with them. We actually have a diversion program, and then people in Prison Project is the same thing. How do we facilitate people coming out to become a productive member of society? Because, by the way, this is often unspoken. 95% of the people that will go to a jail or prison are coming back out. So the question is, not if they're coming out, they are, how do you want them to come out? Do you want them to come out and be a safe, productive person that you don't mind being your neighbor?
Right.
Or do you want to come back and hurt somebody else so they go back in?
Right. I think the Prison Project would be particularly really good for juveniles, because the act of them teaching prisoners, for those of you who don't know, if I remember correctly, they go in and teach prisoners and how to act and whatnot, and through them learning how to deal with emotions of a fictional character, they can relate to it and work through their trauma, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that would be probably really ideal for juveniles. That would also help prevent them from getting, going back in as an adult. Yeah,
and they create mentorship programs for others.
Right.
All the things that we want the system to do, right?
Okay.
So I'm sort of politically all over the place. Like, I don't really have a home. I don't.
That's actually a sense of that's a sign of sanity, by the way.
Thank you. Thank God. I don't particularly like both parties in an abstract like right. This one's good. This one's like no. There's definitely good and bad on both sides. One thing that I have learned over the years is I've seen individuals that I know and just random people on the street, and sometimes I come and ask them, is that sometimes people living in inner city areas get victimized, and a part of that is because they don't necessarily have tools for self-defense. So do you think it would be ideal, or do you think we would be better off, and I know you're going to disagree with this, do you think we'd be better off in terms of sort of building a better culture around gun safety and promoting responsible use of guns and bringing them to the average person in inner cities, because they are dealing with higher rates of crime and violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily have the tools or the money available to go out and, get these things. But also, we don't want to just have a bunch of people on the streets just brazenly using these tools that are super dangerous and they don't know how to use.
Right.
Yeah, to what degree do you think that gun access has helped or hurt crime rates?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you the policy answer, and then
Mhm.
I'm going to give you my personal opinion.
Okay.
My policy answer is that, we have a culture that has interpreted the Second Amendment as being that, we get to have guns.
It's like a fundamental right. It's almost
Right.
religious.
Yeah, exactly. And therefore, we need to look for ways to create responsible gun ownership, right? Which should entail, thoughtful background checks, teaching people how to use them, providing a system of
Agreed.
making that safer. Okay, that's the policy answer that I will give you, because that's based on what our system calls for today. As a personal opinion, I think that generally when you bring a gun to a fight, you end up using it.
Mhm.
And when people are angry and they're having episodes of anger or whatever, if I have a stick, I may use a stick. If I have a fist, I may use a fist. If I have a gun, I'm going to use the gun. So I
Mhm.
think that guns actually create less security and more insecurity. We have seen that reflected over and over again, school mass shootings. But frankly, in our inner city, we see this happening regularly every day, and I think there's a correlation between gun availability
Mhm.
and increases in gun violence. As a nation, we lose more people to gun violence proportionally than any other nation, and they're actually organic control groups there, right? So Australia is a good organic control group, right? Australia was having similar problems to us in terms of gun violence. Now, gun ownership in Australia was not embedded in the culture of the Constitution. So you had a prime minister that basically decided, with the legislation support, we're going to make really hard for people to own guns, especially assault rifles and stuff. They did, and what they have done is the crimes driven by use of guns and the violence has been reduced substantially. On the other hand, we continue to provide more and more guns,
Mhm.
and we continue to see the exponential growth of gun-related violence. If you're a young kid today, you're more likely to die of gun violence than you are to die of anything else, right? Now, and again, I don't want to offend people that think that this inalienable right to go on ownership, because I understand it's there. I'm not fighting that, and that's why I gave you my policy answer first.
Mhm.
I'm not the guy who's going to try to overturn the Constitution. But you have to think about it. Is it a healthy society where if you're a young child, you're more likely to die of gun violence than you are of, a traffic accident or something else?
It's
right?
not. I would agree with that, but I think it's sort of an aspect of it's with that it's multiple layered. You would have to deal with, one, again, culture, two, mental health,
Yeah.
because there are people who commit school shootings or just mass shootings in general clearly are not in the right mental space, and also people who commit crimes with guns typically aren't going to be following any gun laws, whether they are restrictive or not. They're already going to be they're already ready to commit violence against someone. So from my point of view, it seems as if that would be a great way of just sort of creating a baseline of everyone's armed, so there's going to be an aspect of, I don't want to mess with that person because I don't know what they're going to do.
Yeah.
And then also simultaneously having that culture of being this is a tool, this is what it's used for. If you do it for any of these other things, you'll be ostracized, 100% dealt with as a negative impact on society. It's not in the way that a lot of people are thinking about how these things should be handled.
I think that, I hear you, by the
Mhm.
way, and I think in the abstract it may make sense. I think that the problem is that how these things play up is not that way. Look, when I was a kid, and I'm obviously the oldest person in the room, when we got in a fight, generally it was we threw rocks at each other, we punched each other, occasionally somebody pulled a knife, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were no guns, right? 2 weeks ago, L.A. County, and I'm not going to tell you city because I don't want to give people, but we had one lawyer has 6 cases presented, 6 separate cases presented of high school kids bringing guns to school. Okay?
Yeah, no, that's
They did
not
not,
good.
by the way, they did not commit any other crime. They were just simply carrying a gun, and every one of them, when you ask them, why do you have a gun? I said, well, because I need it for self-protection. Okay? Understand, I grew up in a really rough neighborhood. I don't know how many of your audience are going to know where Cudahy is, but Cudahy is a poor community. It was rough now. It's rough now. It was rough. In fact, it was rougher when I grew up, right? But we didn't have kids dying there in the neighboring areas of gunshots, and there were no gunfights, right? There were plenty of fist fights and stick fights and rocks and occasionally, like I said, a knife. But now, we have a community, and I know they're representative of our entire nation, where kids are bringing guns to school because they feel that they need to, and the guns are so readily available. And to me, that's horrifying. I have 4 grandkids, and the concept of one of my grandkids bringing a gun to school in a backpack scares the bejesus out of me.
Yeah, likewise. Well, I don't have grandkids, but
Yeah.
younger people I know.
But
yeah.
hopefully you will one day. Right? Yeah.
I hope so too.
I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you covering that
Yeah.
because that's been an ongoing debate that we're having about
Yeah,
that and about
we're
the nature
gonna
of
back and forth with
of
us.
how the tool changes the hand that uses it.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I do agree with. I've been coming more towards that.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
does, but I still.
No,
A part
listen,
of me is still like, there's just
this.
yeah,
There's some reticence there.
Yeah.
There's no. Look, these are difficult issues.
right.
And I think that we need to talk through them honestly. And I think, frankly, I wish if we could remove politics. I think I would love to remove the R's and the D's and from this and just let's have a logical conversation about what this means. It's in the Constitution. I don't think most people are saying get rid of the Second Amendment. Certainly, I'm not. Right?
No, I don't want him to
Yeah.
make it seem like you are
Exactly.
either.
No, yeah. But it goes back to this interpretation. What our founding fathers intended with this, right? This is a world of muskets, right? This is a world of people thinking that we may need an organized militia to fight the British coming back to take over the colonies, right? I don't think that the founders were envisioning a world of AR-15s and, where we are today.
Semi-automatic pistols, even.
Well, yeah, but they're also, like we had talked about earlier, that social contract and how we interpret the
Yeah.
Constitution will change with the ages. So maybe, because I've seen people make crazy arguments. It's like, well, you have the right to bear arms. That means technically I have the right to have a nuke. And it's like, well, no. It's a nuclear arm, but that's also kind of crazy. So,
well,
no.
Or if you got enough money, why not buy an F-16 or something? Fly it around town. I don't know, right?
Right. There probably should be some sort of amendment to that to an extent.
Well,
but not
thoughtful
completely getting rid of
conversation. Yeah.
not completely getting rid of it.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
I'm sad to say we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Your assistant
Well,
is looking at me
always
accusatorily. Yeah, about that. So
That one took a lot of time.
really a pleasure
Okay.
talking to you.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
really
I hope you
appreciate
come back. This was awesome.
I look forward to it. Let's talk to Anna. We'll set it up again in the future. If we don't want to do it too often, we'll bore the hell out of your audience.
Yeah, no, you seem like
But-
it's someone
but
who's
occasionally-
very, very, very genuinely for prison reform, and I'm all about that because I've known
Excellent.
people who
I'm
have.
for a lot of stuff to reform. I'm for moving
Thank you.
forward and creating
Thank
a
you,
different
Jack.
world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right,
Very
cool.
much.
Thank you.